Welcome to Fort Worth Innovates, a show about innovation, research, entrepreneurship, and startups in Panther City. My name is Cameron Cushman, and I'm the host of this podcast that brings you the stories of the innovators, entrepreneurs, and visionaries that are putting our city on the map as a leader in innovation. With the help of the Fort Worth Tarrant County Innovation Partnership, we are bringing you stories of innovation in our hometown. My guest today is Dr. Anke Hilse, Maitland-van der Zee, who is the professor of personalized medicine and the head of the Department of Genetics at the University Medical Center Groningen in the Netherlands. She came all the way from the Netherlands to join us in Fort Worth as part of a special speaker series hosted by Texas A&M Fort Worth. Dr. Maitland-van der Zee is trained as a pharmacist, a clinical pharmacologist, and epidemiologist. In 2016, she was appointed full professor in the Amsterdam UMC in precision medicine in respiratory disease. Before that, she held several positions at Utrecht University, and she worked as a postdoc at the Human Genetics Center of the University of Texas in Houston. Her main research goal is to bring precision medicine into clinical practice. She desires to move medicine away from using old-fashioned diagnostic labels and advocates for using biomarkers to understand biological pathways and optimize therapy for the individual patient.
Thank you.
So first off, you are here from the Netherlands. You came a long way to be with us today in Fort Worth, but this is not your first time in Texas. I know you spent some time in Houston. Can you tell us how that was? And welcome to Fort Worth, by the way.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course I can. After finishing my PhD, my husband and I wanted to work abroad for a while. And my husband's in chemical engineer in offshore engineering. So Houston made sense. I found a job as a postdoctoral fellow at the Human Genetics Center of the University of Texas. So we lived there for 2 years. We brought our, at the time, 10-month-old daughter, and my second daughter was born there. So we lived there as a young family, and we really had a good time, learned a lot, and also enjoyed being in a different culture. I think it's really good. I think it's really nice to learn how it is to work away from home, to have different traditions, to be the stranger for a bit, because it also helps you understand other people that live in your own culture and are not used to the things that are very normal to you. So I thought it was a very good experience.
So you have one true Texan in your family, but tell me a little bit about what brings you to Fort Worth today. I know this is your first time to Fort Worth, but I know you're here on behalf of Texas A&M Fort Worth and of the Fort Worth and Tarrant County Innovation Partnership. But tell us what you're in Fort Worth to do today.
Well, I'm actually here because I was invited by my colleague and a friend, Professor Gillian Bartlett. She is an associate dean at Texas A&M. And we have been teaching a course in a conference together for, I think, around 15 years. So we know each other for a long time. And we've been collaborating. And she asked me to come here to tell my story.
So you're talking today at this event, and you're talking about precision medicine and some of your work. So can you kind of define some terms for us? How do you define precision medicine, and what is your take on what precision medicine is today and what kind of where we're headed?
Starting with my definition of precision medicine, first of all, I don't think it's something completely new. Personally, I believe that every physician throughout history that has a patient in front of him or her wants to treat the patient, optimal for that particular patient. And I think that's what precision medicine is. We try to optimize therapy for the individual patient. The new thing is that we get more and more tools, right? We are now able to sequence a person's genome. We are able to use lot of omics techniques in that patient. We can measure loads of things in the laboratory, follow those things over time. And we are also aware that it's not just that we should be looking at, but also what's the patient exposed to? Because a patient's not just his own build, but it's also, what kind of food is a person eating? Is he or she exposed to, for example, air pollution? All these things determine our health, right? And I think precision medicine has to take all these things into account to make sure, that we have the optimal treatment for every patient.
That makes a ton of sense. So I know you've also done some work in biomarkers. Can you define what a biomarker is, and why do you think it's important to the future of medicine?
A biomarker is everything that we can measure in our body, right? So it can be a genetic marker, but it can also be the value of your cholesterol or whatever thing we can measure in the body. And this can help us to tell about what's going on in your body, right? Because when you're ill, it means that something out of normal processes is going in a different way. And if we understand what's happening, then it's also easier to treat that, to do something about this. So that's why we need the biomarkers to figure out what's going on.
And would you say that the research around biomarkers is new, or is this something that's also been going on for many years?
Oh, yeah, many years, because I think, cholesterol levels are not new. Measuring tension is not new. So there's lots of markers that we've been measuring forever. But there are new biomarkers that we're now able to measure and that are also finding their ways into clinic, right? And so, yes, we're getting more tools. We're getting more biomarkers, and we have to use them in a smart way, because they're also sometimes expensive, right? And we cannot measure everything in everyone. So the trick is to figure out what we need to know, right, to optimize therapy.
That makes sense. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about your work very specifically on precision medicine, biomarkers, and some of the other things that you're working on?
Yes, so I worked for 9 years at the pulmonary department in Amsterdam University. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I recently moved to the University of Groningen, which is all up north in the Netherlands, and where I became head of department of genetics. But because of my work in the pulmonary department, most of my recent work is in pulmonary diseases. So we've done a lot of work on asthma, both in adults and children, also on cystic fibrosis, COPD, interstitial lung diseases. And all of this work was around understanding what's going on. So, for example, asthma, there's not just one kind of asthma. I think most people that know a little bit about asthma know that some people have complaints when they start exercising, while others have a far more allergic form of asthma. And this has to do with the mechanisms behind it, right? What's going on in the body. And again, if we understand that, then we can try and treat it. We've done a lot of work on microbiome as well. So looking at the bacteria, but also viruses and fungi that are living in our body. And there's a lot of them. And they are both in our upper airway system, but also in our gut. And these have an influence, for example, the gut on your immune system. So we have shown in several studies that if you have a less favorable microbiome in your gut, that, for example, you have a higher risk on exacerbations in your asthma. And you know what? The microbiome is a target. We can target it. I mean, with antibiotics, we can kill bacteria. With probiotics, we can, try and reach a more favorable profile. So yes, there's different biomarkers that can help us figure out what's going on and then try to influence them.
Yeah, so just to be clear, biomarkers have always existed. They've always existed in our bodies. Some have been familiar to us for a long time, like cholesterol. But I think what's different in the research now is that we're finding new biomarkers, and we're finding out which biomarkers affect which indications. So asthma, diseases, gut health, things like that. Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about how you're connecting those two worlds of, hey, we discover a new biomarker, and then we try to figure out what disease it can actually treat or what indication it can help?
Yeah, usually, well, in a lot of our work, it's the other way around, right? We look at people with a certain disease, and then we try to figure out whether we can, for example, identify different groups. So a lot of what we do is take a group of asthma patients, and usually we try to do a group with similar severity of disease, right? So, for example, we take severe asthma patients, and then we look at their microbiome, and we use bioinformatic methods to cluster them. So we say, okay, if we look at the microbiome, can you identify groups that are similar according to the microbiome? And then we compare them on clinical characteristics. So that's how we found out that with a less favorable microbiome, your disease is more severe and you have more exacerbations. We can actually even figure out which bacteria are the ones that are more commonly there in those patients that get the exacerbations. And then the next step would be, okay, if we know that, we never know what the chicken or the egg is, right? Do the patients get the exacerbations because of the microbiome, or do they have the microbiome because they have the exacerbations? Because it's just associations at that moment that we're studying. So that's where you also need more translational research, right? You also need, people in the lab that figure out, okay, what happens, for example, we did quite some work on long COVID. So the syndrome that people have after they had a COVID infection. And there we also found that the less favorable microbiome gives you a higher risk on more complaints. And then there were other researchers that did mice studies, and when they gave these bacteria that were there in the in our COVID patients to the mice, we saw that the mice started to develop symptoms. So that's one of the ways to prove that it's actually these bacteria, this microbiome constitution that causes, right, these complaints in there. So I think that's also really important in this kind of research. We can find associations. We do a lot of these studies. I'm an epidemiologist by training, right? That's how we work. But only when we also validate this in either animal studies or organ-on-a-chip studies, or so also look at the cells, what's happening. If we, I think that's necessary to understand causation, because that's it's really hard in, of course, association studies. So translational research, bringing researchers from very different backgrounds together. So the ones in the labs, the epidemiologists, the bioinformatics, because there's lots of data that we're looking at and we need their ways to analyze the data. Biologists, doctors, physicians, they're all necessary to make sense of this. And I think for me, that's the fun part of this kind of research.
Yeah, and what I love is that you're here in Fort Worth because you're collaborating with colleagues at Texas A&M College Station and now in Texas A&M Fort Worth, which is great. Can you tell us a little bit about what that collaboration looks like, how you work together to advance science, to advance research, and hopefully bring new treatments and cures to market?
I think collaboration is key. We can only move this field forward if we collaborate. And that has both to do with using different expertises, but also different populations, right? To patients in Fort Worth and College Station might be a little bit different from the ones that we see in Groningen, right? And also their lifestyle and their habits are different. So to be able to translate these kind of findings, it's also important to work together over the world, share our findings, and we can help each other forward.
Yeah, I love that. And science, I think, is better when you collaborate because no one person knows it all. And the ability to be able to, bounce ideas off of other scientists, look at different data, look at different work. It's this idea, we talk a lot about in innovation of convergence, right? Where it's not necessarily this technology or this technology, it's where they converge, that the real cures happen, that the real advances happen, that the real new technologies happen. Have you seen any instances of that sort of convergence between research or technologies in your work?
Yes, I think it happens a lot. I think, it's exactly as you describe. And what I said before, we need each other and to not be thinking in circles. You need new input. We always collaborate. There's actually no project that we're doing by ourselves. One of the reasons that Julian invited me was that I've set up a large consortium in the Netherlands. It's a public-private consortium, so we collaborate between companies and academia. And I think that's where also this happens, right? Because we in academia, we like to come up with completely new ideas, and we are at the basics of the science. But if we want to translate this into clinical practice, we need, for example, diagnostic tools, because we need to measure these biomarkers, and doing it in a lab is very different from doing that in clinical practice, right? Because the numbers that you have to do are very different. The time frame that it has to be done in is very different. The budgets are different. So we need companies to help us think about, okay, how can we actually do this in clinical practice? How can we develop a diagnostic like that? And actually the same holds true for therapeutics, right? We can come up with an idea. This is the target. This is where we think it should go. Maybe even with an idea for a compound that could do it. But to really bring it to the market, that's a different skill. That's not for academia, right? That's for companies. And we have brought together like a really large group of companies and academic partners within the Netherlands all working on chronic respiratory diseases. We call our consortium P4O2. P4 stands for precision medicines, for more oxygen, O2. So P4O2 has always many meetings per year where people from both the companies and the academia come together. And that's where it happens. That's where people get to talk during the lunch breaks. And we've seen several examples where people that had never collaborated before found ways to work together. And it's sold over borders, right? I can give you a very simple example of an organ on a chip model that we developed. So these are like cells that are in a I'm not an organ on a chip person, but the good thing is that we can develop cells that act like they're in the body, and we can influence them with, for example, cigarette smoke to see how they respond to that, or maybe with possible medications, right? If we so the cells are in an environment where there's also airflow over it because they resemble the lung, and of course there's air flowing through lungs. And one of the things that we were doing in my group when I was still in Amsterdam was trying in patients to measure volatile organic compounds in air that comes out of the lung. For example, to measure inflammatory markers that are in there because they are also coming into the air you breathe, right? So one of the researchers in my group, Dr. Paul Brinkman, who does this work, he was there with the people that are doing the organ on a chip work. And they said, hey, you know what? Maybe we can measure these markers as well in the air that flows through the chip. And that was a perfect idea because this air really only measures what's coming out of these cells, right? Well, my air has a lot of other things in there, right? Also, the air that's in this room, right? I breathe that in and out. It's influencing it. What I just had for breakfast. I mean, all these things are influencing my breath. That's not happening in these cells. And we saw some really interesting results just looking at the cells that we could then compare with the breath from the humans. And no one had done that before. And it was just because they were sitting in the same room and they were like, hey, why don't we measure it in that little bit of air? And it was different and they had to make a method for it, but they made it work. And yeah, I think that, and if there's good ideas, then there's people from companies, they're like, hey, you know what, maybe we can translate this and maybe we can bring this to the market. And having them very close collaborating with you also speeds up this process, right? Because like I said, some things are good for academia, some things are good for companies, and they need each other. And I think it's a lot of fun to work that way.
I love that. Yeah. And I think it speaks to the diversity that's required for this kind of science as well. Diversity of climates, right? The Texas air is different than the air in the Netherlands. The people are different. The genes are different. The genetic heritage is different. And so all of those things can play into better science because we can understand things that everybody is built a little bit differently. But there are some cures and treatments that can affect everybody, or at least small subsets of those populations. So I think it's a great way to think about collaboration and to work together because that's how you're going to find cures. So you're here to speak in Fort Worth today. Is there anything that you're going to share with the audience today that you haven't already shared with us? Can you kind of give us an overview of what you're going to talk about today?
An overview. Well, what I'm going to talk about is about this public-private partnership, because how we funded it, how we brought it together, how we're working together shows some of the results. One of the things that I told you about was the microbiome in the long COVID patients. That's one of the examples I will show today. I think that's and also, okay, towards the future, how do we make these things sustainable? How can we continue this work and continue these collaborations? Because, if you have to keep writing grants, which we're doing most of the time, that's also difficult, right? And it's very insecure. So is there a way that we can, make more continuous stream of money to keep this going? So we have some ideas about how we might be able to set that up. So I'll share that, and maybe they've got good ideas about how to do that as well. So yeah, I think that's most the big idea behind my presentation. And the thing we have also not talked about yet is artificial intelligence. I think that's another thing. AI is changing our world, and AI is definitely going to influence this because we're talking about lots of data, enormous amounts of analysis that we have to do. And with the computer power and the things that we have now available, that's going to change, right? That's going to give us more possibilities. So my personal idea about, how this will move forward is that that's going to play a more important role, right? And that, maybe in the future, every patient that comes into a hospital will, get imaging done, will have certain layers of omics done, will bring that into the model, and we'll see, how should we treat this patient. I think things will go faster because we'll know more about patients more quickly, more hopefully in the beginning of disease, and hopefully that will prevent worsening of disease, right? Like with the chronic respiratory diseases that I've been studying, most of these patients are diagnosed far too late. If you diagnose a COPD patient, most of the time he or she already lost, like 50% of their lung function. Because until that time, we don't even notice because we got so much overcapacity in our lungs. By that time, it's also too late to cure, right? All we can do is, try to make their life as good as possible. But we would really want to know earlier and try to intervene earlier in preventing, that they have to walk around with an oxygen tank instead of, just being able to walk freely. So I think that's the main thing. Try to figure out more early what's going on with people, and intervene in a personal way.
Well, and I love that because it just speaks to this notion of Fort Worth wanting to become a world-class city for innovation, a world-class city for research, collaboration. And I think that's what Texas A&M Fort Worth has brought to this city is partnerships like the one you're talking about and collaborative research, which is really wonderful for the city. And Fort Worth is really happy to be a part of it, especially with this new campus that's being built in Southeast Fort Worth. So the last question I want to ask, you've already touched on a lot of different innovation, but what innovation that you're working with gets you the most excited?
I think I've talked about a lot of them. I think for now, the one that gives us the most opportunities towards the future is AI. I think being able to make use of these new methods to quickly bring all the data of a patient together, I think that really excites me. And also, I think it's very important to keep, the reason we're doing all this is the patient, right? So let's not get lost in a lot of data and forget about the fact that we're talking about a human being. I think that's what I still want to add here. Because it's not only about what we think is right for the patient. It's also about what the patient can and wants to do him or herself. And that means you have to do it together with the patient. Because if I decide that from today on, broccoli is the best therapy for you for the rest of your life, and you don't like broccoli, it's not going to work, right? So we need to take into account also what's possible, what the patient can afford, and what he or she is willing to do. So that, I think, would be the last thing I want to say. It's all about the patient.
Dr. Maitland-van der Zee, thank you so much for joining me today on Fort Worth Innovates. If you like hearing stories about innovation, research, entrepreneurship, and startups in our city, please subscribe, share, and be sure to tell a friend. The more you engage, the more episodes we can bring to you. Fort Worth Innovates is produced by Kendall Rogers, and today's episode was recorded in the beautiful Sinclair Hotel in downtown Fort Worth in their podcast studio. We are grateful to Farouk Aslam and the rest of the team here at the Sinclair for letting us borrow this room in this beautiful hotel for our recording today. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this podcast, the Fort Worth Tarrant County Innovation Partnership, who are building an innovation district where technology and research combine to build the future right here, right now.